Hey everybody, welcome to Cheeseology with Adam, the cheesiest channel on YouTube. I'm Adam. Today we're going to be making a Queso Fresco. This is Mexican cheese. It's a fresh cheese, so there's no aging time. We do press this a little bit for about a total of 8 hours at different weights, but it is a fresh cheese. We can cut it right away. Queso Fresco is a very popular cheese in Mexico, used in a lot of dishes for when cooking. The nice thing about Queso Fresco is it really takes on the flavor of whatever food it's being cooked with. It is a mild cheese, it's not aged, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just spice it up a little bit. I'm going to be adding some arbol chilies and some ancho chilies, kind of like what I did with my pepper jack, but just to give it a little bit more flavor, because it is going to be a very mild cheese when you eat it, but I like a little bit of heat. Really, there's not going to be a whole lot of heat here. The arbol will have a little bit of heat, but the ancho chili is more of a smoky flavor, so I'm going to be using those. I think it's going to be really, really good. And what's neat is we're going to be using these baskets, these cheese baskets to press in, so it's going to give it a real nice design on the outside of the fresh cheese. I'm going to be using 2 gallons of pasteurized cow's milk. So I'm going to split that between 2 of these, and when we press, I'll stack them. I'll show you all that when we get to that point, but this is going to be a fun cheese that we can eat within a day of making instead of waiting 3 or 4 months like some of the other cheeses that we do. So we'll get started here in just a minute. I'm going to grab all of your ingredients and equipment, and then we'll be set to go. Okay, a couple pieces of equipment that we're going to need. Obviously, as I talk about in my other videos, you need a good stock pot. You need a heat source. I'm doing this in my garage, but you can do all this right in the kitchen. I'm using a hot pad right in my garage, going with my stock pot. 2 gallons of whole vitamin D cow's milk, pasteurized. When using pasteurized milk, you're going to want to use calcium chloride. I actually happen to be out of calcium chloride at the moment, but that's okay. I've made lots of cheeses with pasteurized milk without calcium chloride. What calcium chloride does is help with the curd formation. The rennet actually forms the curd, but through the pasteurization process, because this milk has gone through that, adding calcium chloride will help also with that curd formation. So we have our 2 gallons of milk. We have our stir. As I said, I'm using a couple different peppers here. Now you can use herbs, you can use jalapeno peppers, you can use whatever you want. It doesn't even have to be spicy. I'm just giving it a little bit more flavor because it is that fresh cheese, very mild. I want a little bit more flavor in it than we traditionally would have in a Queso Fresco. So I think this is going to be great. I've never done it this way, so it's going to be exciting to see what it comes out like. Going to need some salt. We are definitely going to need our rennet. I use single strength animal rennet. I mix a 1/4 teaspoon of this with about a 1/4 cup of non-chlorinated water. You can use spring water out of a jug or bottled water, perfectly fine. If you live in an area where your house water is chlorinated, typically don't want to use that. Shouldn't be a big problem though, even if you're using that, because this is a fresh cheese, it's not an aged cheese. So, but I always just stick with non-chlorinated water across the board. As I mentioned, I'm using 2 of these baskets, have a whole bunch of little slits in them. You can use one form if that's what you have. You don't have to use this. You don't have to go out and buy more stuff. This is just what this is what I'm going to be using. As I said, it's going to give it a real nice design on all sides of the cheese when we're done. Going to need some sanitizer. Naturally, all the equipment's clean, but we also want to just spray a little bit of sanitizer on everything. This is a food grade sanitizer that I use. I just give my equipment a little shot right before I start using it. Going to need our curd knife, thermometer, naturally, as I mentioned in other videos, some draining cloth. I use some cheesecloth here, and a bamboo. I use it's a bamboo draining mat. I'm going to fold it for you. It's about $2 or $3 cost for that draining mat. Our culture is going to be C101 culture. You can actually purchase this via the link in the description of this video, along with some of these other items like a curd knife or a thermometer or draining mats. You pretty much get everything there minus the milk and probably the hot pad. They might even have pots there, I forget. But you can get, that's where I get all of my equipment. and then it's in especially all of my ingredients. Really good source for all that kind of stuff via the link in the description. So what we're going to start with now is we're going to put our 2 gallons of milk in our pot. We're going to heat this up slowly to 90 degrees, and then we're going to put in our C101 culture to get the culture acting on the lactose, the milk sugar within the milk. And what we're doing is we're acidifying the milk. Back to the culture here, we'll turn the lactose into lactic acid, and that's what we want to happen. So let's get started. And I'm just going to dump this 2 gallons of milk right in here. Okay, 2 gallons of milk in. Now that our milk's in and I have the heat on, as you just saw, I'm going to let this come up to temperature. We need to put our thermometer in here. I've had this milk sitting out for a couple hours, so it's warmed up a little bit. So I'm not starting from refrigerator temperature. So just want to make sure my thermometer is set right. Looks like I'm about 50 degrees right now. So I'm going to put the lid on, we're going to bring it up to temperature, and then we will add the bacteria culture. And I'll show you all that step by step. Now we're at 90 degrees. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the milk off the heat so it doesn't keep rising. I'm going to take my thermometer out so I have more room to stir. Shut my heat source off. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the culture, and then we're going to let that rehydrate a little bit, and then we'll mix it in about a minute or so. So I'll show you exactly what I'm doing here. Okay, this is my C101 culture in a little packet. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to sprinkle it over the top of the milk. And you can see it's like a powder. What we're going to want to do is let that rehydrate for a minute or so, before stirring, so it doesn't clump up. Okay, we've let our culture rehydrate for about a minute or so. Now we want to stir this in. I like to do up and down motions like this, all the way to the bottom. Real nice and slow. This is a delicate process. We don't want to be splashing the milk around. I want to just gently stir that in. I kind of just go back and forth, up and down, just so that culture is really mixed in well with the milk, so it can start doing its work, converting that lactose to lactic acid. What we're doing at this step is we're acidifying the milk. And then we're going to want to wrap this pot with a towel or something, put the lid on, wrap it with something so we can try to keep it as warm, as close to 90 degrees as possible. And then when we come back, we will be adding our rennet. Okay, that's mixed in pretty good. Just going to put my lid back on, and we'll come back and add the rennet in 45 minutes. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my single strength animal rennet, like I said, a 1/4 teaspoon into about a 1/4 cup of non-chlorinated water. We're just going to mix that around. Just going to pour it in slow. Now we're just going to take our stir and just slowly work that in for about a minute. Want to make sure the rennet gets fully mixed into the milk. Now, if the temperature drops a couple degrees during this period, that's okay. Again, we want to try to keep it where it's at as much as possible. We're going to be heating this back up to 90 degrees once we have our curd set. But as you see, I'm just stirring this very slowly back and forth, up and down, so it gets to the bottom of the milk. And we're just doing this gently, not splashing it around, and that should be pretty good. Now we're going to put the lid back on, and we're going to wrap it with something, and then we'll come back in 40 minutes, and we'll see if the curd is ready to cut. we'll test for a clean break. I'll show you how to do that in a moment once we come back, and then we'll go from there. Okay, it's been 40 minutes that our milk has been sitting with the rennet mixed in. Now we're going to test for a clean break, and that'll determine if the curd is ready to cut or not. And what we're going to do to test for a clean break is we're going to put slit in the curd and then a slit sideways across that slit and kind of lift up a little bit. See how that just separated like that? That looks pretty good. A little bit runnier than I expected, but I still think that's okay. Probably because I didn't have the calcium chloride. Let me just try another piece. It separates pretty good. Okay, we're gonna go with this. We're gonna cut our curd into slices, in the strips, 3/8 of an inch to 5/8 of an inch. So about a 1/2 inch wide average. So what I like to do is I do mine vertical, like this. You want to try to get as close as possible to that 1/2 inch, because if they're too big, they're going to retain too much moisture. If they're too small, they're going to get too dry. So for this particular cheese, we want them about a 1/2 inch wide. And then they'll dry. We're going to be cooking the curd to dry them out, and they'll dry evenly, more evenly if we have a uniform shape or somewhat uniform shape. Now what I do for the horizontal slices, I kind of put my curd knife on a slant, because or else we're going to end up with strips going from top to bottom. We don't really want that. Well, we'll be able to break the curd up a little bit more with our stirrer as we start stirring. But initially I like to just do it like this. Now that we've cut our curds, what we're going to do is we're going to let them sit for about 5 minutes. This helps the slices of the curds heal a little bit before we start cooking them. What I mean by cooking the curds is we're going to heat this back up to 90 degrees and hold it at 90, and we're going to slowly stir these curds, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a moment. We're going to slowly stir these curds for about an hour for this cheese. What we're doing is, by having that temperature of 90 degrees and creating movement with the curds, what it's doing is it's drying them out, meaning the whey, the liquid that we're separating from the curd, there's still some in the curd, so what we're doing is trying to expel that from the curd to a certain degree. We don't want the curds to be super dry, or as dry as we would for like a cheddar or something like that, but if you get a ladle full of curd right now, it's going to be really mushy. It's not going to hold any kind of form or anything. We want to dry those out a little bit to a certain point, which I'll discuss here in a little bit, but that's the whole purpose here. So we want to let these sit for a few minutes now that we've cut these, and then we'll put it back on the heat, and then we'll start stirring, and we'll see what that looks like. Okay, it's been a couple minutes since I cut the curd. What we're going to do now is I put the pot back on the heat source. I haven't turned it on yet. We want to see where our temperature is. Through that whole process of the bacteria, letting it sit to start converting lactose to lactic acid, and also the rennet doing its thing, I've only dropped 4 degrees, so I'm at about 86 degrees. So that's great. Now what we're going to do is we're going to stir these very slowly, while bringing these up to 90 degrees, and it looks just like this. We're doing the initial stir with our curds, and look how they're breaking up real nice like that. That's what we want. And I'm gonna put the heat back on, very low, and I'm gonna slow, so you see how we have some big chunks? You can just take your stir and just slice them. I'm going to make sure we're stirring all the curd very slowly, just really starting to get it to break away from the pot wall, especially because I don't have calcium chloride in here. My curd is a little bit, I think, not as well consolidated, but it'll be fine for the cheese. But as we bring up the temperature back up to 90 and stir these and cook these, they'll firm up and hold their shape. Just very, very slowly. There's a big piece right there. I'm just gonna slice right through that. So now as you stir, even if you're using raw milk, the curds are not gonna hold a perfect shape. That's fine. We just don't want to make them shatter more than we have to. They will break up some as we stir, as we process the cheese. But right now, all we're doing is slowly moving these around as we come up back up the temperature. Right now we're at 84. Looks like it dropped just a little bit once I started stirring this, which is fine. I was probably just getting the temperature of the curd initially, and the way underneath was a little bit cooler. Perfectly fine. But I have the heat on very low, and I'm just going to continue stirring these very slowly. And then once we come up to 90 degrees, I'm going to take this off the heat. We're going to stay at 90. I'm going to continue to stir just like this for this cheese about an hour. So there's a little bit of time. Pull up a stool or a chair, whatever's comfortable for you. And you just want to do this slowly for an hour. If you find that they're breaking up a lot, you can stop and do intermittent stirring. Especially if you find that they're getting dried out faster than that. If they're drying out real fast, you can do intermittent stirring. But you want to make sure that we're drying these out. And I said 60 minutes. This isn't a you must do for 60 minutes every single batch. It's really when the curds are done. At this temperature, at about 90 degrees, it should take around 60 minutes, as opposed to some of the higher temperatures that we cook curd at. But it's really when the curd is done. And when I mean done, for this cheese, you're gonna want a firm curd throughout that has moderate resistance when you squeeze it, but it should break apart or smush pretty easy, but it should be a little bit of resistance on the curd when you take it in your hand and lightly press. If you have it in your hand and lightly press your thumb on it, you should feel moderate resistance throughout the curd. And slightly firm. That's really what we're looking for. And really, that's really something that you can gauge after you've done a few batches. Some cheeses, like cheddar, you dry out more. Or a Parmesan, you dry out more. And you would use a different type of culture at a higher temperature as well. But for this one, we're going to stay about 90 degrees. And we're going to just slowly stir these. Now you can see, let me move so you can see better. When I stop stirring for a moment, just a little bit of stirring I've done so far, you're going to see the liquid on top of the curd now. That's because they're already starting to dry out just from stirring them. They're becoming less buoyant, they're not floating as easy, and they're sinking below the level of whey. By the time we get halfway through this, if I stop stirring, they're going to sink pretty good, pretty quick. And that's just because they're drying out more as we're cooking the curd. So what's happening right now is exactly what should be happening, to be expected. So we're gonna, again, bring this up to 90. I'm at about 84 still. My heat is on very low, so I don't wanna heat these up real fast. Once we hit 90, we're gonna take it off the heat, and then I'll stir it just on my table for about that 60 minutes that I mentioned. So we'll look at this closer here in a little. Okay, I'm almost at 90 degrees. I'm continuing to stir this very slowly. Once I hit 90, I'm going to take my pot off the heat source and I'm going to set it here. I'm going to stir it for probably another 55 minutes. But like I said, I have a stool right here. When you get comfortable, and you just want to do this very slowly, as I just showed you in the video. We'll look at this here shortly when we get to 30 minutes, and I can show you what it should look like. And then we'll go from there. It's been about a half an hour since we started stirring our curd. Again, we brought it back up to 90 degrees after we cut the curd. And now what we're doing is cooking the curd. I'm going to take a look to see what the curd is like at this time. We're about halfway through the recommended stir duration, about 30 minutes in. And we're going to check out the curd and see what we have. We're 30 minutes in, as I mentioned. You can see when I stop stirring, the curds sink pretty quick. Like I mentioned, that's because they're not as buoyant, because we're cooking the curds, we're getting the moisture out of them. What we're looking for is a curd that's firm throughout and has moderate resistance. You can see when I pick these curds up out of the pot, it's not just a pile of mush, they're actually holding some form, which is great, exactly what we're looking for. Now I'm going to take a little clump of these with my finger,
I'm gonna squeeze that. It has a little bit of resistance, but it's still a little mushy. So we're getting there. I think we're on the right track. We're about halfway through the recommended time, but we still want a little bit more resistance for this cheese. So we're gonna stir for another 20 minutes and then we'll take a look at what we have there. Again, we don't wanna overcook the curds and dry them out too much. They won't press properly, but we're on the right track here, and we'll take a look here in about another 20 minutes of slowly stirring the curd, continuing to do that.
All right, it's been about an hour that we've been stirring the curd slowly. Curd is at where it should be with moisture. Then we'll start draining the curd and go from there.
All right, we've been stirring for about an hour. As I mentioned before, when I stop stirring, you're gonna see that the curd drops pretty fast. That's because it's drying out and it's not as buoyant. So let's see what kind of curd we have after about an hour. Remember, we want curd that is firm throughout and has moderate resistance. So I'm just gonna take a piece. See how that's spongy? That's good. If we would have done this when we first cut the curd, it just would have smushed. But that has a little bit of resistance. It's spongy, it's not just a pile of mush. And I think we're good. So this is about an hour after starting the stir, after cutting the curd. And I think we're at a good spot. So we'll start draining and we'll go from there.
All right, what we're gonna do now is siphon off some of the whey, where we have cooked the curds for about an hour. We're at a moisture with the curd that we're happy with. As soon as we stop stirring, the curd is sinking to the bottom. What we're gonna do is just use a cup or a bowl or something and just siphon off some of the whey, just to get rid of some of that. And then what we'll do is we'll dump this into our cheesecloth lined colander for draining. I'm just putting this against the side and just letting some of the liquid flow into it, just to get a little bit out, make it a little bit easier to pour into the colander and drain. Then we'll stop there. It's pretty good, just to get a little bit out. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move over to our sink, and I'll show you what that looks like, and we'll start draining. Okay, we have our colander with some cheesecloth in our sink. Now I'm just going to bring the pot over, and I'm just going to slowly dump this in. You can see curd flowing in there. That's great. You can see there's a whole bunch of curd left inside. Just want to make sure we get that in. Alrighty. Now what we're going to do is, I'm going to pick this up a little bit. Let that drain out. I'm just going to hold it up for a minute or so, just to get a bulk of this out. Well, for this cheese, what we're going to do is I'm going to put this back in the colander in a moment, and then I'm going to spread out the curd a little bit, and we're going to let it drain for about a half an hour. During this time, you want to have you'll probably be in a room that'll be about 72 degrees anyway, but we want to make sure that that's the condition or close to that. It's drained pretty good. So I'm going to set this back in here in my colander. I'm going to spread out my cheesecloth. Break this up a little bit. We're in good shape right now. Spread that out. When we come back in about a half an hour, we can put in any additives that you want to put in. As I mentioned, I'm putting in 2 different types of peppers. You don't have to do that. You don't have to put anything in. But it's just to liven it up a little bit. So we'll add that here shortly, and then we'll salt it, and then we'll get to pressing. But I'll show you all that here in just a little bit.
For this cheese, for 2 gallons, we want to add about 1 ounce of salt. So we want to measure that out. And as soon as we're done draining, we will add that salt and any kind of additives that you may want in there.
Okay, our curd has been draining for about half an hour in the colander. Now we want to do, if you have any additives to put in, this is the time to do that. As you can see, I've cut up, this is 6 arbol chilies and 1 ancho chili. I de-seeded them and then chopped them up real fine. And I'm just going to sprinkle that all over the top. That looks wonderful. As you can see, just mix them in, or just sprinkle them on top. Now I will mix them in. So I just take part of the one side of the cheesecloth, flip it over. You just want to break up any clumps of curd because it will have matted together a little bit. Flip it that way.
What I'm doing is just working this in, getting it evenly distributed in the curd. So when we press this cheese, they're both the same. So I'm using two different forms, or two forms for this, two basket forms, which should make a really nice cheese. Okay, and then as I showed you, I weighed out my salt. Next thing we want to do is we want to salt this right now as well. As you can see, this is mixed in pretty good, but I'll even be mixing it more as I add the salt. So I'm going to use about half of the salt here, and then I'm going to mix it up pretty good, and then I'll put the other half of the salt in. What this is doing when you put the salt in at this point, instead of like putting it on the outside of the cheese or putting it in a brine solution, is we want the bacteria to slow and slow the acid production down. Now we have the other part of the salt in. Keep stirring this, mixing it up. Okay, so we have our curd mixed up real well with our additives and salt. Now the fun part, time to press. Okay, we're almost done for this cheese. What we want to do now is, like I said, I'm using two basket forms. What I've done here is I've taken a piece of cheesecloth, and what we want to do is just line this basket. I leave one side longer so I can fold it over once the curd's in there. So that's how I do it. Get that set up like that. We're going to do that to both of these. And now we're going to transfer this curd split between these two forms. And try not to drop it on the table like I did. And when we put it in here, you just want to kind of fluff it up a little bit. We don't want to make sure there's not any big, huge clumps. So we know that we're filling these evenly. And I just put in a handful at a time on each of the forms. And these will definitely, if they seem like they're filling up, they will definitely press down. Probably be to about a third of the height that they'll be once we fill these. And how I'm going to press this is I'm going to use my Dutch style cheese press, as you can see right here, and I'm going to stack these. And when I flip these, I'll switch which one is on the bottom, just so it's even. We're going to start off with only about 5 pounds of pressure on these cheeses for about a half an hour, and then we'll up it from there. But I'll go through that with you as we actually go through this process. So what I'm doing now is just making sure these are even. I have all my curd transferred. I smooth it off on top. I think that's pretty good. Lightly tap it down. I want them even as possible. And I'm wearing a glove because the Ardbell chilies have a little spice, and I don't want to accidentally rub my eye or something like that, which I've done many, many times. As you can see, I have these filled up. They're about 3/4 of an inch from the top on these baskets, both of them the same. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this cheesecloth over. I'm going to fold this one over. Doesn't have to be perfect, just trying to protect it a little bit. And also what the cheesecloth does is help wick the moisture away from the surface. So you definitely want to use, when pressing cheese, always want to use cheesecloth. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stack this one on this one. And then this, what's called a follower, this actually goes inside of another form, but I'm using it for this because it fits nicely. And that's how we're going to press. I'm going to put this piece of pipe just inside here because on my Dutch style cheese press, there's a circle piece right here that presses down. That's about a little bit smaller than this hole in the follower, and I don't want it to jam in there or go sideways. So just putting something in there like this helps it stay flat and it presses evenly. So all we're going to do now that we have these stacked, we're going to put these under our press like this. I want to make sure it's centered under this straight post here, pole that's going to push down. Make sure the pan is going to drip into your sink. You can do this right in your kitchen. And now that I think that's even, I'm
I'm going to take my jug of water that I've measured out. That will equal 5 pounds of pressure down on that cheese. And I'm going to hang it like that. And I can see there's all kinds of whey already coming out. That's perfect. All right, it's been a half an hour that we've been pressing with 5 pounds of pressure. What we're going to do now is we're going to take these out. We're going to flip the cheeses in each form and then flip the forms. So let's see what we have after the first press. All the whey sitting in the tray, that's good. So this one was on bottom, so this is going to be on top on this next press. Oh, nice, look at that. Pretty. As you can see, this first flip, maybe a little tricky. There's going to be an edge on it because we hadn't flipped it yet, so we're pushing that down, and it's going to look like this. Okay, I'm just going to fold this cheesecloth over like that, like we did before. And I'm going to fold this one over as well. Stack these again like I did. Put our follower on. Now we can put these back under the press with the increased weight, and we're going to do 12 pounds for an hour. When we pull these out next time, they're going to be a lot more consolidated. All right, we want to make sure it's straight, make sure they're just stacked evenly, not off to one side. Now we just want to put our weight on here. So if you saw my other video on how to use a Dutch style cheese press, I'm not actually putting 12 pounds here, I'm putting 6 pounds, and it's going to be 12 pounds of pressure. Check out the Dutch style cheese press video on how to use that, and it'll explain all of that. But I love this press, it makes it very, very easy to press cheeses, and I have great results every single time. So now we have 12 pounds of pressure pushing down. We flip these cheeses into form, and then we flip the forms to make sure that we're getting equal pressing. So we're going to leave this for an hour, come back, and we're going to increase the weight to about 25 pounds of pressure for several hours, but I'll go over that once we get to that point. All right, our cheese has been pressing now for an hour at 12 pounds. Now we're going to take it out, and we're going to see how it looks. Got a lot of whey on the draining pan, that's good. Take out the follower. Ooh, that's looking nice. So what we're going to do now is we're going to flip these. So this one was on bottom, it's going to be on top now, and this one will be on bottom. Take the cheese out, and you're going to see getting a nice little pattern on it. What we're going to do is rewrap this, we're going to flip the cheese so the other side presses, and we're going to put the weight up to about 25 pounds. We're going to do it for 3 hours, and then we're going to flip it and press again for another 3 hours at the same weight. Just rewrapping this, put it back in this basket form. These are kind of neat. It's when you have a semi-soft cheese like this, it gives a nice pattern to the cheese on the sides, on both sides. So I'm going to stack these again, put it back under our press, and we're going to hang our 25 pounds of weight. And just make sure it's straight. Looks good. 25 pounds pressing down. So in 3 hours we will come back, flip everything again, flip it within the form, and then we'll flip the baskets. Press for another 3 hours, and then we'll be done. Okay, our cheeses have been pressing for about 3 hours at 25 pounds. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take the weight off, we're going to pull the cheeses out, unwrap them and flip them like we did in the other intervals. But you should have consolidated pretty good by now, so let's take a look. So this will be on bottom next time, and this will be on top. Pretty good. A little lopsided. Smells fabulous. You can see the peppers throughout, that's great. Put this one on the bottom. We're going to hang our weight back up. And we're going to press this for another 3 hours. All right, 3 more hours and then the pressing's done. From there, we're going to pat it dry. We'll put it in our aging space maybe just overnight, just to let it dry a little bit and just settle. And then tomorrow it'll be ready to eat. But we'll take a look at this once we're done the final pressing. So I'm happy with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this drying mat in my aging space with the 2 cheeses on it just overnight. And then after that, you can wrap it in wax paper, and you should probably eat this within a week. This is a fresh cheese. This should be pretty flavorful with all the peppers that I put in here. So can't wait to try this. I think it's going to be great. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.